At the edge of Berlin's Spree River, facing the reconstructed Imperial Palace and the Humboldt Forum, stands a countersite, BARAZANI.berlin. What follows is not only the Humboldt Forum's history as seen from across the river and BARAZANI.berlin's perspective, but the story of German society that slowly begins to shake off its colonial amnesia. Let's start with the Humboldt Forum. The reconstructed Berlin Palace with the Humboldt Forum, with its Baroque style facades and modern wings, opened in 2020. The site was formerly the imperial Stadtschloss of the Hohenzollern dynasty, demolished after World War II and later rebuilt amidst high controversy. The Berlin Palace, or Stadtschloss, was for centuries the residence of Prussian kings and German Kaisers. It stood as a potent symbol of militaristic and imperial power until the German Revolution of 1918 ended monarchic rule. Under the Hohenzollern emperors, who were responsible for Germany's short-lived but brutal colonial empire, policies of conquest, enslavement, and genocide were pursued in colonies like today's Namibia, Tanzania, and other countries or places in the world and societies. The palace's history is thus deeply entangled with German imperialism and colonial atrocities. After heavy damage in World War II and the separation of Germany into East and West, the then established communist East Germany demolished the ruin in 1950 as a deliberate break with the fascist and imperialist past. The communist Palast der Republik was built on its site in the 1970s, only to be torn down after reunification in the 1990s. At that time, the reunified German government approved an ambitious project to reconstruct the palace's exterior and create the so-called Humboldt Forum within. This alleged universal museum should present the vast collections of the Prussian Heritage Foundation and present its highlights from Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Oceania. This new palace opened on December 16, 2020, during the pandemic and the lockdown. From its very beginning, the project had drawn criticism for being a nostalgic revival of imperial architecture, housing thousands of artifacts acquired in colonial times. Critics argued that fusing an imperial palace and looted ethnological collections on Berlin's central square would send a troubling message. The very concept of a museum that calls itself universal in a rebuilt palace struck many as tone deaf. In short, the Humboldt Forum, often called Germany's most expensive cultural project at over 600 million, became a lightning rod for debate about Germany's colonial amnesia and how to represent this part of history in the 21st century. A broad coalition of anti-colonial activists had been dismayed by the Palace project from the beginning of its conceptualization. This protest movement branded itself No Humboldt 21, and the 21 signifying the 21st century. It argued that displaying pillaged artifacts from Africa, Asia, and the Americas in a resurrected Prussian palace would perpetuate colonial injustice rather than critically confront it. In June 2013, shortly before the cornerstone ceremony of the Schloss, No Humboldt 21 issued a public resolution demanding a halt to the Humboldt Forum project and a rethinking of its concept. The declaration condemned the plan as, quote, violating the dignity and property rights of communities worldwide, end quote. To place treasures back into the Hohenzollern Palace, the very dynasty responsible for colonial oppression, including genocide and concentration camps, was seen as an insult to the descendants of colonized peoples. As a matter of fact, the activists were entirely ignored by the museum establishment for another decade. From the start, No Humboldt 21 was driven by a transnational network of post-colonial advocates, many from Berlin's Black and diasporic communities. Key actors came from organizations such as Afrique Avenir International, Berlin Postkolonial, Afrotag TV, Cyber Nomads, Each One Teach One, or in short EOTO, and the Decolonize Berlin Alliance. This collective voice helped put debates about colonial loot and memory on the public agenda in Germany. In October 2013, for example, the Humboldt Forum's planners were met with pointed questions when activists staged demonstrations and teach-ins during the many debates on the museum's concept. Over the years, No Humboldt 21 kept up pressure through petitions, open letters, and creative public actions. The campaign resorted to artistic interventions to inform and engage the public. From 2013 to 14, members of this coalition curated the so-called anti-Humboldt box, assembled by the artist-activist group Artefakte Anti-Humboldt, together with Afrotag TV Cyber Nomads. It was essentially a museum in a suitcase like Marcel Duchamp's La Boîte en Valise that could pop up in various venues. It showcased a series of miniature photo panels with exemplary objects with problematic acquisition histories, quote unquote. Amongst them were the Benin bronzes, sacred artworks, ancestral and human remains, explaining how these came into German possession during the colonial era. Another art initiative was the visionary poster campaign, Decolonial Objections to the Humboldt Forum. No Humboldt 21 and Afrique Avenir plastered large posters around Berlin that pointedly asked how Prussia's cultural heritage could include stolen Asian and African artifacts, and called out the cynical, quote-unquote, dialogue of cultures narrative of the Humboldt Forum. These actions were covered in local media and blogs and succeeded in injecting critical perspectives from marginalized communities into what had largely been a top-down project from white people for white people. In 2017, even one of the Humboldt Forum's own advisors, art historian Bénédicte Salvoy, resigned in protest at the lack of transparency, saying the Humboldt Forum cannot be opened without addressing colonial violence. By 2019, the pressure from activists and international debates, such as France's Savoy report, forced German authorities to acknowledge the issue. Hectically, plans were announced to eventually return looted artifacts, most prominently the Benin bronzes, to their countries of origin. By 2020, as the Humboldt Forum's opening neared, activists shifted tactics from solely protesting against the institution to creating an alternative forum alongside it. The result was BARAZANI.berlin, an interactive virtual exhibition space for anti-colonial knowledge. BARAZANI draws its name from the Swahili word baraza, meaning council or forum, to emphasize its function as a space for open dialogue and collective discussion. The name was given by legendary Berlin activist Nyaka Sururu Mboro and voted for by the already mentioned decolonial NGOs. BARAZANI.berlin was launched in December 2020, precisely 3 days before the Humboldt Forum's inaugural virtual opening. It had to be virtual due to the COVID lockdown in Berlin. BARAZANI was explicitly framed as a continuation of the No Humboldt 21 campaign, but in a new form. A transnational cultural project carrying the protest into the digital realm of imaginary exhibitions. The initiators, a collective of international artists, curators, scholars, and activists who had long voiced critique of the Humboldt Forum, positioned BARAZANI as a way to, quote, digitally subvert the question of the physical side, end quote, of the Palace Museum. In essence, BARAZANI was meant as a virtual Humboldt Forum of its own, one that centers colonized people's perspectives and refuses to gloss over genocidal violence. For many years, BARAZANI served as an online forum, hosting virtual exhibitions, archives, and events that critically engaged with colonial history and its ongoing legacies. Its opening project presented a chronicle of resistance against the Palace and Humboldt Forum in an imaginary underground information center featuring an interactive timeline retracing protest actions over the years. Visitors could explore key moments in the struggle, from early interventions like the 2009 anti-Humboldt conference to the 2013 No Humboldt 21 rallies. Deeper down, in the reconstructed basement of the Prussian castle, BARAZANI presented video installations of demonstrations by Ovaherero and Nama people who protested Berlin's inadequate recognition of the genocide in Namibia. A poem about this huge blind spot of German memorial culture by Berlin author and artist Laya Ukongo was another one of BARAZANI's intervention in the Humboldt Forum and Schloss. Its title, Ma'afa, the Great Catastrophe, the Suffering. Only by acknowledging the transgenerational trauma of Africa, only in shared grief can true reconciliation become possible. The BARAZANI platform blended historical documentation with contemporary art to create a virtual reality without 3D environments or augmented reality. It relied on methods borrowed from conceptual art and imaginary museology. BARAZANI demonstrated during the pandemic and the lockdowns in the city how digital activism or hacktivism can be used to democratize the discourse on colonial museums and collections in the post-internet world. It positioned itself as a repository of counter-memory and began to work in partnership with other resistance initiatives like CCWA, the Coalition of Cultural Workers Against the Humboldt Forum. CCWA was a like-minded group of artists and cultural workers committed to boycotting the Humboldt Forum altogether. This team started to meet at and crowdfund a shared physical space, literally behind the Humboldt Forum, across the River Spree at Spreeufer 6. CCWA, in the meantime, staged performance protests on the Museum Island Bridge facing the Forum, unfurling massive banners that read "Tear it down" in front of the reconstructed palace. Their campaign slogan, "I don't participate because," communicated a conscious cultural boycott, and to this very day, many artists and academics publicly decline involvement, arguing that decolonial discourse happens elsewhere until the institution changes its foundations.